Hi there. The Church of Nowhere on Civil War. And this is related to a question: could there ever be a civil war in Britain? And civil war is a pretty terrible thing. There's a picture by Salvador Dali depicting the Spanish Civil War of a person eating himself, literally, like somebody with cancer or immune deficiency syndrome or Ebola or something. The body being eaten from the inside, eating itself. And so civil war is a pretty grisly matter, as we all know. Yugoslavian civil war, Rwanda civil war. There's been lots of civil wars. Civil war in Chad, Somalia. They're ghastly. There's no doubt about that. And when you think about the UK, for example, obviously the only real civil war that Britain has actually had was the so-called English Civil War between the Protestants and Catholics, which resulted in the execution of King Charles I. And that's when people literally sat around and planned a military conflict with the forces loyal to the king. There was a roundhead generals actually planning military campaigns and battles and etc. like that. So because that obviously should be the definition of a civil war. And then, of course, we mustn't forget, perhaps the most significant, I suppose, is the Easter Rising of 1916 in Dublin, and then the war, the Irish War of Independence, which lasted pretty much up until Christmas 1920. And then it became a civil war within Ireland about over the treaty. But before then, Ireland was part of the UK, so you can count the rising in 1916 and then the corresponding War of Independence from I suppose 1919 as a civil war within the UK, and that's when people sat around a table and actually planned a war, planned a military takeover of the institutions of government. 1916, the actual the Dáil was declared, which was the Irish Parliament. A revolutionary government was set up, and their objective was to get rid of the British invaders, as it was, of course, right up to 1920, the Irish War of Independence. And so that's when people sit around a table and they plan a war. They import guns and explosives from other countries like Germany and the USA, and it's a bloody war, but fought between professional and semi-professional soldiers. And you could, like the English Civil War, was a war between professional and semi-professional soldiers as well, and volunteers and conscripts. It's a savage business, Civil War. Now I've got a list here of all the dates that I think are significant. It's my own dates, and I put near civil wars. Well, you know, rebellions, civil rebellions. Can you count those as being civil war? But there could be a precursor to a civil war, and certainly rebellions, maybe if they're not checked, could develop into something more. So you got 1832 Reform Act, and there was, of course, the middle classes went on a tax strike, so they refused to pay their income tax unless they got electoral reform, which they did get. So that's headed off at the pass. The 1848 Chartists, of course, wanted further electoral reform in the UK, and there were actual armed rebellions and riots during that time in 1848. So again, the upper classes are kind of a bit afraid there, but they did put that down with force, violence from the state, and execution of ringleaders and etc. Then there's a big long gap really until 1916 Easter Rising and the Irish War of Independence, which we covered. 1919, there was apparently a near revolution in Britain, obviously inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917. It's not a very well documented and perhaps a fragmented rebellion amongst the working classes, but again could have been sort of semi-organized, and there were people sort of seriously thinking about revolution, which perhaps would have resulted in a civil war in the UK in 1919. And then we come up to the 1926 general strike. I think that's very serious, although it only lasted 6 days. I think as far as the upper classes were concerned, they were looking down the barrel of possible total insurrection, revolution, and civil war there. Although the ordinary working class people just thought that they were going on strike for better wages and conditions. But no doubt there were also hotheads amongst the TUC that wanted to go further. And certainly the ruling classes went into total paranoia at that point as well, worrying about the fact that the Soviet Union was still a viable proposition by that time, and possibly could be involved in encouraging a revolution in Britain at that time. And then we come right up to 1984 with the miners' strike. Again, this is a very significant date. It was obviously a rebellion of sorts, obviously a protest against the closure of all the mines in the UK and Wales. Lots and lots of mines closed. And some people have said this was the beginning of the end of the trade union movement in the UK. After that, it became increasingly difficult to go on strike, and you have to have ballots, and there was a lot of, and the police were very brutal in the way that they put down the miners' strike in 1984, which could have led to more violence, which actually did lead to quite a bit of violence, in fact. But because it was only like one, because the TUC chickened out actually of supporting the miners, as they did in 1926, in fact, nothing more came of that. So that was sort of headed off at the pass with a mixture of promises about revitalising areas hit by the closures, and also police putting the strike down with quite a lot of force, and of course a lot of strike breakers as well, blacklegs, helping the bosses over that particular difficulty. And then you come right up to March 1990 with poll tax riot in London. And all that summer there were demonstrations, riots, conflicts with the police, lots of things going on there. But that was headed off at the pass as well, because the government just rebranded the tax, and everybody quietened down after that, with a few little tweaks and twiddles to that. And then you get quite nasty, the noughties, of course, the anti-austerity, anti-globalist riots in Europe and demonstrations in Europe, around about the 2008, and then going up to 2010. Again, quite nasty possibility there, a revolution. I don't really know. A lot of people very angry with the banks, of course, put down with a certain amount of brutality by the police. Although, of course, by this time the police are far more accountable in the UK, and they can't actually just go around clubbing people to bits like they used to. Well, they have to, but they have to be rather sneaky about it, because it's more difficult to get away with it nowadays. 2016 EU referendum. Now, this was a pretty interesting time, because they said it was a very divisive period of British history, and I think that's true. I think if the government had taken no notice of the referendum, and for some complicated reason had actually revoked Article 50, and Britain had not left, and this actually we're on the eve now of possibly getting a deal, so that Britain can leave on the 31st of October of this year. I think if the Liberals had their way and Britain had not left the EU, I think you'd be looking at a tax strike by the middle classes again, like in 1832, and a lot of trouble, a lot of bitterness, possibly not actual rebellion or revolution. I would say more like tax strike, and self-employed people refusing to do VAT returns, things like that. There would be kind of a soft rebellion going on from the right wingers, but not actually people getting out their muskets and swords exactly. And then we come up to the present week, in fact, this week of 2019. Of course, the Extinction Rebellion people, but I don't see people with muskets and swords coming out on the streets either. It's all pretty peaceful and genteel, and sort of good-humoured. I can, I don't think commuters are going to get hold of guns and start shooting the protesters for disrupting their commuter service from Tottenham Court Road. Maybe one person might do that in a sort of frenzy, but he'd be gunned down by the police and dismissed as an individual nutcase. So I don't see any revolution. So the answer is, could Britain have a civil war? I'm really not sure that like all these dates here, and you may dispute these dates, and you may think my list is too short or too long. It doesn't seem like Britain could really enter into a civil war. It has to be something to do with tribalism. And the worst tribalism has come from religion, the Protestants versus the Catholics. And of course, I shouldn't really, obviously, I shouldn't not mention the troubles in Northern Ireland from the late 1960s on, almost to the present day, with the latest actual bomb going off near the border in Northern Ireland last year, I think it was. So there we go, Catholics versus Protestants. So when we look at religion, the bloodiest, 3,600 people died during the Troubles. I don't know how many thousands of people died in the English Civil War. But there we go, the English Civil War was a culmination of violence between Catholics and Protestants ongoing for hundreds of years, reflected in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, of course, with Catholics versus Protestants, two tribes going to war. It seems that religion actually is more the cause of the bloodiest war. Tribalist religion is more the cause than anything else. All these other rebellions and have been over secular issues, humanist issues, even issues of electoral change, issues of money, of wages and working conditions, things like that. But when you actually get two tribes powered by religion, by religious conviction, then you have the bloodiest encounters of all, culminating in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which of course is within the UK. So that is actual civil war within the UK, and we've had it for like 30, 40 years, okay? So that's how serious the Troubles are. And I don't think a lot of people living in the UK really realised that, or realise that still. Britain has had a civil war within its boundaries for 30, 40 years, since the 1960s, pretty much up until quite recently. And possibly, remnants of terrorist violence are actually still around today. And don't forget, Stormont is still not even, is been, dismantled or disbanded, which is supposed to be the Parliament of Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is still being ruled directly from Westminster, which is hardly, I would suggest, a peaceful culmination. It's just the lid's being stamped on the problems in Northern Ireland, but they certainly haven't gone away. And so, we can really safely say, I think, that religious tribalism, as indeed, well, that's certainly true of Yugoslavia, religious tribalism is the cause of all the most horrific civil wars that have ever been. And if there are any civil wars in the future, it would be over something like religion. So I suppose the moral of the story is that even new religious movements, even the religion of nowhere, really has to be very careful that it doesn't sort of have a tribal following, because there's no doubt about it that tribal followings do lead to actual violence. And we only have to think of literally the Beanfield riot in the 1980s of the peace convoy. That was a kind of tribalist thing there. It wasn't religious exactly, but it was New Age and very tribalist and very aggressive and very anti-social and anti-society. And there was quite a bit of violence associated with the peace convoy and Stonehenge and meat gatherings and free festivals and all that kind of thing, So there are rebellions going on all the time. In fact, you could say any rave that happens in the USA or Europe or Britain is a sort of expression of peasant rebellion, a working class rebellion or underclass rebellion against the status quo, usually put down by a certain amount of force I have to say, by the police and the security forces. But religion seems to me to be the main culprit in civil wars and in all the violence and horror associated with civil war. Unless we are talking about a sort of Marxist bloodless revolution whereby all the workers go on strike and everything is changed without violence or the minimum amount of violence, which honestly doesn't seem to be what history shows. History shows that revolution leads to anarchy, anarchy leads to civil war leads to tyranny, and so it all goes round again. So that's kind of my little thoughts, on religion and civil war, basically, which is what this video is actually about.